So now it's time to start filming. The first step is to set up your camera. When you're filming interviews, always use a tripod. On the one hand, it gives you a really steady shot, and more importantly, it makes sure that your attention is on the subject and not on the camera. The equipment is set up, leave it be, and interview. The second step is to set up your peripheral equipment, for example your lighting. It's really important that there's direct light on the face of the person that you're interviewing. In addition to your lighting, you also now should be setting up your audio equipment, for example your lavalier microphones. And these are plugged into your mobile phone or your tablet or to a sound recorder that you might have. Once you've plugged your microphone into your sound recorder, your tablet or your phone, make sure you start recording sound immediately. The last thing that you want to do is to finish your interview, to finish your scene and realise that you've forgotten to record your sound. The next step is to set up your shot. The most important thing when you're setting up your shot is to make sure that your subject is fully in screen, that their face is completely within shot and anything that you don't want in shot isn't visible to the camera. The next step is to make sure that your shot is in focus. This is absolutely essential. And every time that you touch the camera, even the tiniest of touches or brushes, make sure that you refocus your camera on your subject. It can be the difference between a brilliant shot and an unusable shot. The next step is to position yourself for filming. Make sure that you're comfortable. As we've said before, filming always takes longer than you think it will. Make sure you're comfortable. You might be there for a while. The next step is to make sure that your interviewee is also comfortable. They might be there for a while answering your questions, and you want them to remain still and attentive and able to answer your questions in the best possible way. Make sure they're comfortable, make sure they're smiling, make sure they're happy. The next step is to press record. Once you press record, do this because it will give you a spike in your audio recording that will give you a chance to marry up the video with the audio. And it also gives you a place where you know that you started something new. And do this every time that you have another take. Let's summarise and go through the steps. First, make sure your camera is in the right position. Secondly, organise your lighting, making sure that your subject has got light on their face. Third, ensure that the microphone is in place and that you've pressed record on your sound recorder or mobile phone. Make sure that the camera is in focus. Press record on your camera. Make sure that you are comfortable. Make sure that your subject is comfortable. Start recording with a clap. If you follow this checklist, you will ensure that you have usable footage that's stable, well lit, and with good quality audio recording. Good luck.
The Kain Gang are a Native American people who have lived in the forests of southern Brazil for thousands of years. From the middle of the 19th century, however, European colonisers remade that world in their own image. But despite the violence which was inflicted upon them, the history of the Kain Gang is not defined by the suffering which they have faced. Instead, it is defined by their resistance to colonisation. The Kain Gang have existed for at least 3,000 years, 1,000 more than Christianity. In that time, they've developed a rich culture and civilization built around their relationship with the forests of that region. The arrival of European colonisers in the middle of the 19th century, however, changed everything.
When the slave trade was forbidden, they needed people to work in the big farms above in the northeast and in Sao Paulo. And England had forbidden Brazil from importing slaves from Africa. So they instead set about enslaving the indigenous people. And those who refused to work were killed on the spot. So they would bribe some indigenous people and give them a higher rank to force the others to work. They started buying and contracting people to get rid of and kill all the indigenous peoples that lived here. And for every indigenous person they killed, these hired people, they had to prove it by bringing a pair of their ears.
despite being routinely mistreated by the region's new colonisers, who tended to think of them as savage and lacking in civilization, the Kain Gang possess an intricate cosmology, upon which a complex and rather beautiful culture is built.
The mythology consists of two main parts, two different parts, Khmer and Kairu. The entire organisation, including nature, the entire world, is divided in two. The origin of the mythology is that two mythological brothers arose from the centre of the earth. One was called Khmer, and the other one was called Kairu. This is the origins of the two separations of the tribe, each one representing one piece. But it creates everything else, including the trees and the jungle. For example, a typical tree, the Araucaria, which is tall and very straight up, is from Khmer. Because the Khmer represents the vertical stripes. Another type of tree, which is round, falls into the category of the Kairu, because the Kairu is represented by the spots. And one of the most interesting things is that the spots can only marry with the people who represent these vertical stripes. And in this marriage is the fundamental basis of Kain Gang society.
The Kain Gang are no longer hunted down, but old prejudices linger on, despite the complex beauty of their culture.
We suffer a lot from prejudice, especially in the city where we go to sell our handcraft. It mostly comes from young kids, because they don't understand proper social rules or don't understand the cultural differences.
Our problem and our suffering comes from our handcraft. Even from the government that needs to allow us to bring our craft to the city to sell, we have some issues with that.
A lot of prejudice is about the young kids that are working. But the non-indigenous people don't understand that it's not a slave job for kids. It's mostly about their culture. It's a process they need to go through.
Why do you have to deal with so much prejudice from some people?
Because they don't like the Indians.
We suffer a lot of attacks, but not just the Kain Gang people, but the entire indigenous community as a whole. The right to land, the right to different healthcare, the right to a different education. These are rights that are being taken away from us.
In the English-speaking world, ignorance of the Kain Gang exists on an altogether different scale. The Kain Gang are barely known at all in the English-speaking world. The last major book-length study of them was published in 1941. This book here is called Jungle People by Jules Henry, who was a North American anthropologist who went to live with members of the community, went on a number of hunting expeditions, learned the language. And actually there is some value in this book. Henry does make some interesting observations and does give us some interesting knowledge about the history and practices of the Cain Gang. Unfortunately, Jules Henry had a very colonising perspective on things, and in spite of his best intentions, that comes through in his writing. And the result of that is that he continuously misunderstands a lot of the things that he sees around him. And he actually sees this as part of a process of cultural suicide, because as far as Henry's concerned, the Cain Gang are their own worst enemies. And whether he realised it or not, was essentially absolving the colonists of their responsibility, despite the fact that they are physically hunting down the Cain Gang, changing the landscape around them, and expecting them to either conform or to disappear. The ignorance of English speakers about the history, culture, and even the existence of the Cain Gang creates problems of a different kind. But wherever ignorance of another culture is encountered, it should always be challenged.
The explorers found the indigenous through their expeditions. They had wanted to bring both ideology and to conquer the land. But they found a different culture because these indigenous people used music, art. They had celebrations.
This dance was one which the tribe performed before going to war, and is just one example of how the community remembers their history. But a part of the colonising process is denying the equality, or sometimes even the existence, of indigenous cultures. For centuries, Europeans have linked Native Americans to images of the wolf, a symbol of savagery and wildness. This wildly successful movie from 1990 shows just how deeply ingrained that imagery is. It is the story of a white soldier who adopts the ways of the Lakota. The soldier's relationship with this wolf is symbolic of that transformation. His move away from the ways of white America to something else. European werewolf stories are an extension of that symbolism. In fact, the very first werewolf movie, which was released in 1913 and has since been lost to history, told the story of a Native American woman who transformed into just such an animal, literally becoming the symbol of anti-civilization. But the Cain Gang also tells stories about werewolves, because, just like Europeans, they recognise that they possess a sophisticated form of civilization. And so they have a folklore of their own, which speaks about those who reject that mode of civilization, just like Europeans do.
We want people to have a better understanding of what it means to be indigenous, to really be seen as the same as non-indigenous people. Because even though we have different culture, different religion, different costumes, we are still just people.
In 2001, there still remained a small group of the Cain gang in downtown Chapico who still resisted being led away. They lived in extreme poverty. Their parents would not teach them Portuguese, and they wouldn't go to school. They would basically live in tents or on the streets with nothing above their heads, and surrounding them were mansions and big houses, which made a lot of people angry.
We were looking for support as a group so we can gather together and fight for a little piece of land. The government of Chapico wouldn't let us come too close to the city, so we had to come very separated, very segregated from the actual village.
We, as Cain Gang indigenous, we don't recognise the same limits and territorial borders as the state does. We acknowledge the traditional land, and we are not invading. It was actually the state that invaded where we lived.
To understand the Cain Gang, I think you need to understand that their culture evolved in the forests of southern Brazil. And as a result of that, that fundamentally shaped their cosmology. Now, that's not the same as how some Europeans or colonisers or neo-spiritualists like to oversimplify the relationship between indigenous peoples and the natural world. The Cain Gang have a very specific relationship to a very specific place. And that is what shapes a large part of their worldview.
We went on to discover that Chapico was actually an indigenous area. The seniors found out, and the government, along with the entire state, gave us some land. The land is not traditional, but it was a trade made with indigenous people and the government. We live from the nature, and we are in communion with the nature. So we are very happy about that. We don't have everything we need, but we have some, like the river for us to fish.
Relocating us to a more secluded place, closer to the rivers, closer to a jungle, would allow for us to live in our own traditional ways.
Every single handcraft is just as important to us as the other, because they mostly use the same materials from nature. We see worth in nature itself, not as much as the handcraft we make from it. That's something that non-indigenous people don't understand.
I think that the Cain Gang face a similar problem to every other indigenous tribe in Latin America, which is how to integrate themselves into the modern society without losing their culture. Of course, they also have to deal with how to overcome poverty and the prejudice of society. But through our collaborative projects with Chapico University and the Cain Gang, those problems will start to disappear, because they're also being integrated into society through education.
I'm studying to be a teacher, to study the intercultural exchange between the indigenous and the non-indigenous. I think that this course will really help me as an activist for the indigenous cause, to get enough knowledge and experience that I can go back to my community and bring some sort of relevance to it.
Before the university started this process, alongside the government, the education of young indigenous people had always been a challenge. because there weren't many teachers that were willing to teach them within their own communities.
We come from a very close group within the indigenous community. And when we join the university, we have a very positive impact upon our society. Within the social sciences course, we get 4 specialisations. But specifically, within the geography region, we can do a lot of work about the territorial aspect of our land. Within the history and historic part of our course, we can really rewrite history from our point of view and retell the true story. The philosophy aspect allows us to really be and understand who we are, and understand better our community with the soil, the trees, the nature, the water, all of that.
And today, we're currently with the second class of teachers that will graduate by the end of the year.
For 10-15 years now, there's been a lot of progress about joining the universities, because it wasn't a common thing for someone to leave high school and join university right after.
The past century has seen the Kind Gang stand up to many challenges, but perhaps the most powerful part of their culture is the way in which happiness and hope are built into the very foundations of their cosmology.
I am happy because it's a tribe thing that the Kind Gang people are always trying to be positive and happy about their lives.
They taught me a lot about being more human, about being more accepting, and to better acknowledge the existence and the life of the other. They are always happy. They never complain about anything. And that has taught me as well to deal with my issues in a more serene way, in a calmer way.
I'm thankful that you're here. It's good that I'm being filmed to show everyone about the Cane Gang.
Thank you for coming. I'm honored to have you guys here from another country, and thankful to you guys, happy to spread the word, to lower the prejudice.
I think the first thing that we need to learn is how much we don't know. Not just about the Kind Gang and other Indigenous peoples, but about ourselves. Because I think it's very easy to look at Indigenous peoples like the Kind Gang through a colonising lens and expect that they have something to learn from us rather than the other way around. The first thing we need to accept is that it's up to us to learn, and it's not up to the Kind Gang or any other Indigenous people to explain themselves on terms that we can understand.